In the dusty heartlands of Virginia, where the summer sun shows no mercy and the red clay soil cracks like broken promises, where the wind carries the acrid smell of gunpowder and dried blood across endless tobacco fields, there lived a mule who had earned his place in American military legend without ever meaning to. His name was Thunder, though the soldiers of the 15th Virginia Regiment called him by 1,000 different names. The stubborn son of Richmond, the beast of Bull Run, or simply, that damned mule who won't die. The animal bore scars that told stories of battles fought and survived. A deep groove along his right flank from a Confederate Minié ball that had passed clean through without dropping him, another jagged mark on his left ear from shrapnel that had left him partially deaf on that side. But the largest scar, a twisted rope of healed flesh that ran from his left shoulder, blade down to the middle of his ribcage, came from a Confederate cavalry saber that had caught him during a midnight skirmish near Fredericksburg. The blade would have killed any other mule, but Thunder had merely snorted and kept moving, as if nothing had happened at all. The landscape around him reflected the harshness of his own existence. Virginia in 1863 was a land caught between worlds, where nature itself seemed to understand that a war was tearing the country apart. The oak trees stood bare and black against the pale sky, their branches reaching out like the bones of long-dead giants. The ground was split from months of drought, deep cracks running through the earth like wounds in the soul of America itself. When the wind swept across the rolling hills, it carried more than just dust. It brought the sounds of distant warfare, the deep boom of artillery, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the desperate cries of boys dying far from home. Thunder was no ordinary mule, brother. He was a massive beast, built like a fortress on 4 legs, with a broad chest and powerful haunches, a large square head and dark eyes like midnight over the Shenandoah Valley, eyes that held the dignity that comes from watching hundreds of men die without flinching. His coat was deep brown, almost black along his mane and tail, and his entire body radiated a legendary stubbornness that the Union soldiers respected more than their own officers. His hooves had been hardened by years of marching over rocky mountain paths, tough as hammer blows, and his ears, long and alert, moved constantly like the antennae of some great insect, picking up every sound of battle around him. The soldiers said that Thunder could hear the whistle of a bullet a full second before any human ear could detect it, that his nostrils could pick up the scent of gunpowder from 2 miles away, that his eyes could distinguish movement in the dust that remained invisible to human sight. The way Thunder moved was a study in animal grace and military precision. Even in his most routine actions, a simple walk to the water trough, a leisurely graze at the edge of camp, there was something in his bearing that commanded respect. His steps were never hurried, but always purposeful. When he raised his head to scan his surroundings, he did so with the attention of an experienced sentinel. His large dark eyes seemed to see everything, to catalog it, to evaluate it. The veteran said that Thunder knew when an attack was coming before the officers gave their orders. Thunder had been with the 15th Virginia Regiment for years, since 1861, when the war had just begun and the Union Army was recruiting men, horses, and pack animals without any discrimination whatsoever. The mule had carried rifles, transported food, carried wounded men on his back when no stretchers were available, and above all, he had hauled dynamite and ammunition with a composure that defied all animal logic. Explosives didn't frighten him. Shells that fell all around him couldn't make him run. The rifle volleys, the cannon blasts that shook the earth to its foundations, the screams of the dying that seemed to come from hell itself, none of it could disturb the damned animal. It was as if Thunder carried the blood of American liberty in his veins, as if he understood in his own animal and incomprehensible way that he was participating in something larger than his own life, beyond the boundaries of his small animal existence. During the long winter nights, when the camp was wrapped in eerie silence, you could often see Thunder standing alone, his gaze fixed on the distance, as if he were waiting for something or looking for something that only he could understand. The younger soldiers, who hadn't yet been completely numbed by the brutality of war, swore that in such moments they saw a strange melancholy in the animal's eyes, a sadness that seemed too deep and too human for a simple mule. The way Thunder moved was different from other pack animals. He didn't just trot forward like an ordinary mule. He marched. His steps had rhythm, purpose, an almost military cadence that fascinated the soldiers. When the mule walked through camp with a load of ammunition on his back, men turned to watch, not just out of curiosity, but out of genuine respect. There was something in the way Thunder held his head high, the way his eyes looked straight ahead, the way his hooves touched the ground, that suggested this animal knew exactly what he was doing, that he had a mission and was determined to complete it, no matter the cost. When other pack animals became nervous at the sight of blood or the smell of death, Thunder remained unshakable. There were days when he walked among the corpses of fallen comrades without so much as blinking, as if he understood that death was an inevitable part of the game he was playing. This acceptance, this unshakable calm in the midst of chaos, made him more than just a work animal, it made him a symbol. The soldiers of the 15th Virginia Regiment. Hardened men who had crossed deserts and valleys. Who had seen things that would make a saint weep. Said that thunder was a miracle of pure nature. That some Union saint had touched the animal with blessed hands to give him this impossible courage that seems supernatural. Others, the most superstitious among the soldiers, those who still believed in the old stories their grandmothers had told them by the fire, swore that thunder was the spirit of some fallen Union soldier, condemned to carry ammunition until America was free from the chains of slavery. There were soldiers who crossed themselves when thunder passed by, as if the animal were holy, touched by the hand of God Himself. The truth was probably much simpler than the soldier's imagination could comprehend. Thunder was simply a stubborn and proud animal who didn't know how to give up, who didn't understand the concept of defeat. And that made him braver than most of the men who surrounded him in the ranks of the 15th Virginia Regiment, more determined than the generals who shouted orders from their horses. The superstitions around thunder grew with each month. With each battle he survived. An old corporal named William Jackson, who came from Tennessee and had been a blacksmith before the war, told anyone who would listen that thunder had once been hit by a direct artillery strike and had emerged unharmed from the smoke. Another veteran, a thin man from Ohio named Samuel Morrison, swore that he had once seen thunder leading wounded soldiers to the medics, as if the animal were a four-legged angel of mercy. There were stories about thunder that were passed from soldier to soldier. Stories that were told during cold nights around campfires, when the wind whistled through the tents and men sought distraction from the reality of war. One of the most popular stories told of the Battle of Chancellorsville, where thunder had transported a load of shells to an advanced position while Confederate artillery bombarded the entire area. A shell had exploded so close that it had thrown the mule into the air. The soldiers who saw this were certain the animal was dead. But thunder had gotten up, shaken off the dust, and continued walking, as if nothing had happened. Another story, one the soldiers particularly loved, told of a day when thunder had broken free from his post and walked alone into enemy territory. The soldiers thought the mule had gone crazy, that they would never see him again, but 3 hours later he had returned, followed by a lost Union soldier whom he had found in a shell crater and led back to camp. The most dramatic of these stories concerned a foggy night in February, when a group of 20 Union soldiers on patrol had gotten lost. The weather had been terrible, with thick fog that limited visibility to a few yards. The soldiers had wandered in circles for hours, unable to find their way back to camp, while the temperature dropped dangerously. Thunder, according to the story, had ventured out into the night on his own and found the lost patrol. The animal had led them safely back to camp, through terrain that would have been difficult to navigate even in daylight. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated didn't matter much to the men of the 15th Virginia Regiment. What mattered was that thunder represented something they desperately needed. The certainty that courage existed. That determination could triumph over impossible circumstances. That sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys won. In a war where young men died by the thousands, where friends disappeared overnight, where hope seemed as fragile as morning mist, thunder was solid proof that miracles could happen. The mule had become the unofficial mascot of the regiment, but more than that, he had become its soul. When morale was low, when the men were exhausted and dispirited, when defeat seemed imminent, thunder's mere presence reminded them that they were part of something larger than themselves. The animal never complained, never showed fear, never gave up. In a world where everything seemed to be falling apart, thunder represented stability, endurance, the unbreakable American spirit. On this particular morning in late June, the heat was already oppressive by 7 o'clock. The Virginia sun beat down mercilessly on the Union camp, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that made everything appear to waver like a mirage. The soldiers moved slowly, conserving their energy for what they knew would be a long, brutal day. Thunder stood in the shade of a large oak tree, his massive head lowered, his eyes half closed, but his ears constantly moving, always alert to the sounds around him. The previous night had been particularly difficult. Confederate forces had launched a series of probing attacks along the Union lines, testing for weaknesses, creating confusion and fear. The sound of gunfire had echoed across the hills until well past midnight, and when dawn finally came, it revealed a landscape scarred by fresh shell craters and marked with the dark stains of blood on red Virginia clay. Captain Robert Williams, the commanding officer of the 15th Virginia Regiment, had been up all night coordinating defenses and planning the day's operations. Williams was a career soldier from Massachusetts, a man who had graduated from West Point with honors and had served on the frontier before the war began. He was respected by his men not just for his tactical skills, but for his genuine care for their welfare. Williams understood that in a war like this, where brothers fought brothers and the very soul of the nation was at stake, maintaining morale was as important as maintaining supplies. The captain had been watching thunder for several minutes, noting the way the mule's ears swiveled constantly, the way his nostrils flared occasionally as he tested the air. Williams had learned to read Thunder's behavior like a barometer of approaching danger. The mule's instincts were often more reliable than the intelligence reports that came down from headquarters. "Sergeant Thompson," Williams called to his senior non-commissioned officer, a grizzled veteran from Pennsylvania who had been with the regiment since its formation. "I want you to prepare Thunder for a supply run. Intelligence reports suggest that our advanced positions are running low on ammunition, and we can't afford to have them caught short if the rebels decide to press an attack." Sergeant Thompson nodded, understanding immediately. He was a practical man who had learned long ago not to question orders that made sense, and this one definitely made sense. The advanced positions were crucial to maintaining the Union's hold on this section of Virginia, and keeping them supplied was essential to the regiment's survival. Thompson had a special relationship with Thunder. He had been the one to train the mule when the animal first joined the regiment, and he understood the animal's moods and behaviors better than anyone else. Thompson knew that Thunder could carry more weight over longer distances than any other pack animal in the regiment, and he knew that the mule could be trusted to complete his mission even under the most difficult circumstances. "What kind of load are we talking about, Captain?" Thompson asked, already mentally calculating weights and distances. "Full ammunition resupply for Company A and Company B," Williams replied. "Plus medical supplies and whatever food we can spare. The positions have been under harassment fire for 3 days, and they're starting to feel the pinch." Thompson nodded again. It would be a heavy load, but Thunder had carried heavier. The mule seemed to take pride in his ability to transport massive amounts of supplies, as if he understood that the success of the mission depended on his strength and endurance. "I'll need Private Johnson to help with the loading," Thompson said. "And I think we should send someone along as an escort, just in case the rebels have patrols in the area." "Take Corporal Davis," Williams agreed. "He knows the route, and he's good in a fight if things go bad." Corporal James Davis was a young man from Vermont, barely 20 years old, but he had already proven himself in several skirmishes. He was quick, intelligent, and most importantly, he was one of the few soldiers in the regiment who seemed to understand Thunder's unique personality. Davis had a natural affinity for animals, and Thunder had accepted him as a trusted companion. The loading process began in the early morning hours, while the camp was still relatively quiet. Thompson and Johnson worked methodically, carefully balancing the load to ensure that Thunder would be able to move efficiently. The mule stood patiently while they worked, occasionally turning his head to watch their progress, but never moving from his position. The ammunition was the heaviest part of the load: wooden crates filled with rifle cartridges, boxes of percussion caps, and several kegs of gunpowder. Each item was carefully wrapped in canvas to protect it from moisture and secured with rope to prevent shifting during transport. Thompson had learned through experience that a poorly balanced load could be dangerous, not just because it might slow Thunder down, but because it could cause the animal to stumble or lose his footing on difficult terrain. The medical supplies were lighter but equally important: bandages, surgical instruments, bottles of laudanum for pain relief, and precious bars of soap for cleaning wounds. These items were packed in a separate section of Thunder's load, protected by oilcloth and marked with red crosses to identify them as medical supplies. The food consisted mainly of hardtack, dried beef, and coffee beans, basic sustenance that would keep the advance companies fed for several more days. It wasn't much, but in a war where supply lines were constantly threatened, even basic food could mean the difference between survival and starvation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thompson made his final adjustments to Thunder's load. The mule now carried nearly 300 pounds of supplies, a massive burden that would have broken the back of most animals. But Thunder seemed unaffected by the weight. His breathing was steady, his posture erect, his eyes alert and ready. "You ready for this, old boy?" Thompson whispered to the mule, scratching behind his ears in the way he knew Thunder enjoyed. The animal's ears flicked forward, and his tail swished once, gestures that Thompson had learned to interpret as signs of agreement. Corporal Davis appeared at Thompson's side, carrying his rifle and a haversack containing his own supplies for the journey. Davis had volunteered for escort duty, understanding that the mission was crucial to the regiment's success. He also genuinely enjoyed working with Thunder, finding the mule's calm presence reassuring in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. "Route looks clear from here to the advanced positions," Davis reported to Thompson. "Scouts came back about an hour ago and said they didn't see any Confederate patrols along the main trail." Thompson nodded, but he knew that the situation could change quickly. Confederate forces were known for their mobility and their ability to appear where they weren't expected. The route to the advanced positions passed through several areas that could provide cover for enemy troops, and Thompson had no illusions about the dangers they might face. "We'll take the northern trail as far as Miller's Creek," Thompson decided. "It's a little longer, but it keeps us in friendly territory for most of the way. Once we get to the creek, We'll have to cross open ground for about half a mile, but after that we should be covered by our own pickets. Davis agreed with the plan. He had walked the Northern Trail several times and knew it well. The terrain was challenging in some places, with rocky sections that would test Thunder's sure-footedness, but it was generally safer than the more direct routes that passed through areas where Confederate scouts might be lurking. Captain Williams approached the group as they were making their final preparations. He had been watching the loading process from a distance, and he was impressed as always by Thunder's calm professionalism. The mule seemed to understand the importance of what he was doing, and he approached each mission with a seriousness that rivaled that of the human soldiers around him. Sergeant Thompson, Williams said formally, I'm entrusting you with one of the most important supply missions of this campaign. Our advanced positions are counting on you, and I know you won't let them down. We'll get through, Captain, Thompson replied with quiet confidence. Thunder's never failed to complete a mission, and he's not going to start now. Williams nodded, then turned to address Davis directly. Corporal, your job is to make sure Sergeant Thompson and Thunder reach their destination safely. If you encounter enemy forces, your priority is to protect the supplies and ensure they get through. The men at those advanced positions are depending on what you're carrying. Understood, sir. Davis replied, straightening to attention. Williams then approached Thunder directly, placing his hand on the mule's neck. The animal turned his head slightly to look at the captain, his dark eyes calm and intelligent. It was a moment that struck all the observers as strangely moving, a career officer showing his respect for a four-legged soldier who had earned his place through courage and dedication. Take care of yourself out there, Thunder, Williams said quietly. We need you to come back safe. The mule's ears flicked forward, and Thompson could swear that the animal understood every word the captain had said. There was something in Thunder's expression that suggested awareness, comprehension, perhaps even a sense of duty that went beyond simple animal instinct. The small party set out from camp as the morning mist began to lift from the valleys. Thompson walked beside Thunder, occasionally checking the security of the load, while Davis ranged ahead, scouting the trail and watching for any signs of danger. The pace was steady but not hurried. Thompson knew that Thunder could maintain his current speed for hours without showing signs of fatigue. The Northern Trail wound through a landscape that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Rolling hills covered with hardwood forests stretched as far as the eye could see, broken by occasional clearings where farmers had once grown corn and tobacco. But the war had left its mark on everything. Many of the farms were abandoned, their fields growing wild, their buildings damaged or destroyed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of Thunder's hooves on the packed earth of the trail and the occasional call of a bird in the trees above. As they walked, Thompson found himself thinking about the war and what it meant for all of them. He had been a farmer before enlisting, working a small plot of land in Pennsylvania where his family had lived for 3 generations. The war had taken him away from everything he knew and loved, thrown him into a world of violence and uncertainty that he had never imagined. But it had also shown him things about himself that he might never have discovered otherwise. He had learned that he was braver than he had thought, more resourceful, more capable of leadership than his quiet farm boy demeanor might have suggested. Walking beside Thunder, Thompson was struck again by the parallels between his own experience and that of the mule. Both of them had been taken from peaceful lives and thrust into the chaos of war. Both had adapted, found their place, discovered abilities they hadn't known they possessed. But while Thompson looked forward to returning to his farm when the war ended, he wondered what would become of Thunder. The mule had become so much a creature of war, so perfectly adapted to military life, that it was hard to imagine him in peacetime. The trail began to climb as they approached the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The terrain became more challenging, with loose rocks and steep sections that required careful navigation. Thunder's load shifted slightly as the angle of the trail changed, but the mule adjusted his gait automatically, maintaining his balance with the skill of an experienced mountaineer. Davis dropped back from his forward position to walk alongside Thompson. I've been thinking about what happens after the war, he said, echoing Thompson's own thoughts. What do you think will become of Thunder? I mean, he's been a soldier longer than most of the men in the regiment. Thompson had been wondering the same thing. I suppose he could go to one of the veteran soldiers who wants to take him home, he replied. Thunder's earned the right to spend his retirement in a nice pasture somewhere, eating good grass and not having to worry about bullets and shells. But would he be happy? Davis asked. I mean, look at him. This is what he does. This is who he is. Can you imagine Thunder as a farm mule, pulling a plow or hauling hay? It was a disturbing question, and Thompson didn't have a good answer. Thunder had become so identified with his military role that it was indeed difficult to imagine him in any other context. The mule had been transformed by the war just as much as the human soldiers around him, and perhaps the transformation was permanent. They walked in silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. The trail continued to climb, and the forest around them grew denser. Thompson began to feel the first tingles of unease that had served him well throughout the war. It wasn't anything specific, just a general sense that something wasn't quite right. He had learned to trust these feelings, knowing that they often provided warning of danger before more concrete signs appeared. Thunder's behavior seemed to confirm Thompson's growing concern. The mule's ears were constantly moving, scanning for sounds that might indicate trouble. His nostrils flared frequently as he tested the air for unfamiliar scents. His pace remained steady, but there was a new tension in his movement that suggested heightened alertness. "Davis," Thompson said quietly, "I think we should be extra careful from here on. Something doesn't feel right." Davis nodded, understanding immediately. He had learned to trust Thompson's instincts, and he had noticed the change in Thunder's behavior as well. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready, and began to scan the trees around them more carefully. They were now about halfway to their destination, in an area where the trail passed through a narrow valley between two wooded hills. It was exactly the sort of terrain that favored ambushes, and Thompson began to regret his decision to take the northern route. The more direct trail might have been more dangerous in some ways, but at least it didn't involve passage through such obvious choke points. Thunder suddenly stopped walking. His ears pricked forward, and his entire body became rigid with attention. Thompson had seen this behavior before, and he knew it meant that the mule had detected something that his human companions had missed. "What is it, Thunder?" Thompson whispered, placing his hand on the mule's neck. He could feel the tension in the animal's muscles, the coiled readiness that meant Thunder was prepared to react to whatever threat he had sensed. Davis had also stopped, his rifle now held ready. He was scanning the tree line above them, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of sunlight on metal that might indicate the presence of enemy soldiers. For several long moments, they stood motionless. The forest around them was completely silent, too silent, Thompson realized. There were no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, none of the normal sounds that should have been present in a healthy woodland. It was the silence that comes when predators are near, when all the prey animals have hidden themselves and are waiting for danger to pass. Thunder's head turned slightly to the left. His attention focused on a particular section of the hillside above them. His ears remained pricked forward, and Thompson could see the whites of his eyes as the mule stared intently at whatever had caught his attention. Then they heard it, the distinctive metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked. It was a sound that every soldier learned to recognize. A sound that meant death was only a trigger pull away. The sound had come from the hillside where Thunder was looking, confirming once again the mule's superior ability to detect danger. "Confederate patrol," Davis whispered, barely breathing the words. "At least one, maybe more." Thompson's mind raced as he considered their options. They were in an exposed position on the trail, carrying valuable supplies that the enemy would love to capture. Running was an option, but Thunder's heavy load would slow them down and make them easy targets. Fighting was another possibility, but they were outnumbered and in a poor tactical position. Then Thunder made the decision for them. Without warning, the mule stepped off the trail and began moving steadily up the hillside toward the source of the threat. It was completely contrary to Thompson's expectations. He would have thought that Thunder would try to move away from danger, not toward it, but the mule seemed to have his own plan. And Thompson had learned long ago to trust Thunder's judgment in critical situations. "Follow him," Thompson whispered urgently to Davis. "Thunder knows something we don't." They began moving up the hillside, using the trees for cover, following Thunder's lead. The mule moved with surprising quiet for such a large animal carrying such a heavy load. His hooves found secure footing on the rocky slope, and he seemed to instinctively choose a path that provided maximum concealment from the enemy position above. As they climbed, Thompson began to understand Thunder's strategy. The mule was not moving directly toward the Confederate position, but rather angling to come at it from an unexpected direction. By the time the enemy soldiers realized that their intended targets were no longer on the trail below, Thompson, Davis, and Thunder would be in a position to either attack or bypass them entirely. It was a brilliant tactical move, and Thompson was amazed that a mule, no matter how experienced, could demonstrate such sophisticated understanding of military tactics. But Thunder's behavior throughout the war had consistently surprised him, and he had long since stopped trying to explain the animal's remarkable abilities. They were now moving along the contour of the hillside, roughly parallel to the trail below but well concealed by the forest. Thunder continued to lead, his steps sure and silent, his massive load somehow not hindering his movement through the dense undergrowth. After several minutes of careful movement, Thunder stopped again. This time his attention was focused ahead and slightly above them. Thompson could now see what the mule had detected. A Confederate soldier crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle trained on the trail below where they had been walking only minutes before. The soldier was young, probably not much older than Davis, wearing the butternut gray uniform of the Confederate Army. His attention was completely focused on the trail below, and he had no idea that his intended targets were now positioned above and behind him. He was alone, which suggested that this was a single scout rather than part of a larger patrol. Davis raised his rifle, preparing to eliminate the threat, but Thompson placed a restraining hand on his arm. There might be other Confederate soldiers in the area, and the sound of a shot would alert them to the presence of Union forces. If they could bypass this single scout without detection, they would be much better off. Thunder seemed to understand the need for stealth. The mule began moving again, this time angling even further up the hillside to give the Confederate position a wide berth. His movements were so quiet that even Thompson, walking directly behind him, could barely hear the sound of his passage. They spent the next 20 minutes working their way around the enemy position, moving slowly and carefully through terrain that challenged even Thunder's remarkable sure-footedness. At one point they had to cross a rocky section where one wrong step could have sent them tumbling down the hillside in a cascade of loose stones that would have alerted every Confederate soldier within a mile. But Thunder navigated the crossing with the skill of a mountain goat, finding secure footing where none seemed to exist. When they finally reached a point where Thompson felt it was safe to resume their original course toward the advanced positions, he was exhausted and amazed. Thunder's tactical sense had not only saved them from an ambush, but had enabled them to complete their detour without losing any time or compromising their mission. The mule had demonstrated a level of military sophistication that would have been impressive in a human soldier with years of experience. "That was incredible," Davis whispered as they regained the main trail. It was like Thunder knew exactly what that rebel was planning to do. Thompson nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. He had seen Thunder demonstrate remarkable abilities many times before, but this was something entirely different. The mule had not just reacted to danger, he had anticipated it, analyzed it, and developed a counter-strategy that had neutralized the threat without firing a shot. "I've never seen anything like it," Thompson admitted. "It was like having a four-legged general leading us through enemy territory." Thunder seemed unaffected by the praise. The mule simply continued walking at a steady pace, his ears constantly moving as he monitored their surroundings for additional threats. His breathing was still regular despite the difficult detour they had just completed, and his load remained perfectly balanced and secure. They were now less than an hour away from the advanced positions, and Thompson began to feel cautiously optimistic about their chances of completing the mission successfully. The most dangerous part of the journey seemed to be behind them, and Thunder had proven once again that he was far more than just a pack animal. The trail began to descend as they approached Miller's Creek, the last major landmark before reaching their destination. The terrain here was more open, with fewer trees and more opportunities for long-distance observation. Thompson could see smoke rising in the distance, marking the location of the Union advanced positions. They were almost home, but Thunder suddenly became agitated. The mule's ears went back against his head, and he began to move more quickly, his hooves striking the ground with increased urgency. Thompson had never seen Thunder behave this way before, and he immediately became alert to whatever threat the mule had detected. Then they heard it, the distant sound of gunfire coming from the direction of the advanced positions. It was not the sporadic crack of skirmishers trading shots, but the sustained rattle of a full-scale firefight. Someone was attacking the Union positions that Thompson, Davis, and Thunder were trying to resupply. "Damn," Thompson muttered. "The Rebs must have launched an assault just as we were getting close." Davis was already checking his rifle and cartridge box, preparing for battle. "What do we do? Try to get through? Or wait for the fighting to die down?" Thompson looked at Thunder, who was now stamping his hooves impatiently, as if urging them to hurry. The mule seemed to understand that the men at the advanced positions needed the supplies he was carrying, and he was eager to complete his mission despite the obvious danger. "We go through," Thompson decided. "Those men are counting on us, and Thunder's not going to let them down." They began moving more quickly, descending toward Miller's Creek as the sound of gunfire grew louder. Thompson could now distinguish the sharp crack of Springfield rifles from the deeper boom of Confederate muskets. The battle was definitely in progress, and it sounded like it was intensifying. As they approached the creek, they could see muzzle flashes in the trees ahead, brief orange sparks that marked the positions of the combatants. The Union advanced positions were located on a low hill overlooking the creek, while the Confederate forces appeared to be attacking from the wooded area to the south. "There." Davis pointed to a section of the Union line where the firing seemed to be particularly heavy. "That's Company A's position. They must be under pressure." Thompson nodded. Company A had been holding the most exposed position in the Union line, and intelligence reports had suggested that they were running particularly low on ammunition. If the Confederate attack was focused on their position, they would be in desperate need of the supplies that Thunder was carrying. But getting to Company A's position would require crossing several hundred yards of open ground that was currently being swept by Confederate fire. It would be dangerous for humans, and potentially suicidal for a mule carrying a large, visible load. Thunder, however, seemed undaunted by the prospect. The mule was now moving with obvious urgency, his earlier calm replaced by what Thompson could only describe as determination. It was as if Thunder understood that this was the moment that would define his entire military career, the test that would prove his worth once and for all. "He wants to go through," Davis observed, watching Thunder's behavior. "He knows those men need what he's carrying." Thompson made his decision. "Then we go through. Thunder's gotten us this far, and I'm not going to doubt him now." They approached the edge of the open ground, where they could see the full scope of the battle unfolding before them. The Confederate attack was indeed focused on Company A's position, with gray-clad soldiers advancing in short rushes from one piece of cover to another. The Union defenders were responding with rapid fire, but Thompson could see that their volleys were becoming less frequent, suggesting that they were indeed running low on ammunition. "Stay close to Thunder," Thompson told Davis. "If we keep the mule between us and the Confederate line, his load will provide some protection from enemy fire." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only option that offered any chance of success. Thompson took hold of Thunder's halter, not to guide the mule. Thunder clearly knew where he needed to go, but to ensure that they all moved together as a unit. Thunder stepped into the open ground without hesitation. The mule's pace was steady and purposeful, neither hurried nor hesitant. His head was held high, his ears forward, his entire bearing radiating the confidence of an animal who knew exactly what he was doing. The Confederate soldiers spotted them almost immediately. Shouts went up from the enemy line, and Thompson could see rifles being turned in their direction. But Thunder didn't waver. The mule continued walking steadily toward the Union position, his hooves striking the ground with a rhythm that sounded like a drumbeat of determination. The first shots came from individual Confederate soldiers who had broken off from the main attack to engage this unexpected target. Bullets whistled through the air around them, kicking up spurts of dust from the ground near Thunder's hooves. But the range was long for accurate rifle fire, and the mule presented a difficult target as he moved steadily across the open ground. Thunder's behavior during this passage was extraordinary. Despite the bullets flying around him, despite the obvious danger, the mule never broke stride, never showed any sign of fear or uncertainty. His breathing remained steady, his pace constant, his attention focused entirely on his destination. It was as if he had entered some sort of transcendent state where external threats simply didn't matter. Thompson found himself almost hypnotized by Thunder's unwavering determination. He had seen courage in many forms during his military service, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The mule was demonstrating a level of bravery that transcended species, a dedication to duty that would have been remarkable in a human soldier with years of training and experience. More Confederate soldiers began firing at them as they approached the halfway point of their crossing. The volume of fire increased dramatically, and Thompson could hear bullets striking the wooden ammunition crates on Thunder's back. But somehow, through luck, divine intervention, or Thunder's own supernatural protection, neither the mule nor his human companions were hit. The Union soldiers at Company A's position had spotted them now, and Thompson could see men standing up in their rifle pits, cheering and waving their caps. The sight of Thunder approaching with desperately needed supplies seemed to energize the defenders, and their return fire intensified noticeably. Almost there, Davis shouted over the noise of the battle. "Thunder's going to make it." And indeed, the mule was now only 50 yards from the Union line, still walking with the same steady determination he had shown throughout the crossing. His load was still intact, still properly secured, still ready to provide the ammunition that would enable Company A to continue their defense. But the Confederate commanders had apparently decided that stopping Thunder was worth a major effort. Thompson could see enemy soldiers rising from their positions to get better shots at the approaching mule. The volume of fire directed at them increased to a crescendo that seemed to fill the air with the buzz of deadly projectiles. It was at this moment that Thunder's military training and animal instincts combined to produce something truly remarkable. The mule suddenly broke into a gallop, not in panic or fear, but with calculated precision. His powerful legs drove him forward with surprising speed for an animal carrying such a heavy load, while his movements remained controlled and purposeful. The burst of speed caught the Confederate marksmen by surprise. Shots that had been carefully aimed at a walking target suddenly went wide as Thunder's acceleration threw off their calculations. The mule covered the remaining distance to the Union line in a matter of seconds, arriving at Company A's position like a cavalry charge conducted by a single, determined animal. The Union soldiers cheered wildly as Thunder trotted into their position, his mission finally complete. Thompson and Davis followed close behind, both amazed that they had survived the crossing unharmed. The mule stood calmly in the center of the rifle pit, his sides heaving slightly from the exertion of his final sprint, but otherwise showing no signs of distress from the ordeal he had just endured. Captain Harrison of Company A approached Thompson with obvious relief written on his face. Harrison was a young officer from New York, barely out of West Point, but the responsibilities of command had aged him prematurely. "Sergeant Thompson," Harrison said, grasping Thompson's hand warmly, "I can't tell you how glad we are to see you. We were down to our last few rounds, and the Rebs have been pressing us hard all morning." Thompson began directing the unloading of Thunder's supplies, working quickly to get the ammunition distributed before the Confederate attack resumed. The soldiers of Company A worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that their survival might depend on how quickly they could resupply their rifle pits. Thunder stood patiently while his load was removed, occasionally turning his head to watch the activity around him. The mule seemed to understand that he had accomplished something significant, but he showed no signs of self-congratulation or pride. For Thunder, completing the mission was simply what was expected, what he had been trained to do. As the last of the ammunition crates was carried away, Thompson took a moment to examine Thunder for any injuries he might have sustained during the crossing. Despite the intense fire they had endured, the mule appeared to be completely unharmed. There were several bullet holes in the wooden crates that had been on his back, and one of the ropes securing his load had been cut by a near miss, but Thunder himself had emerged from the ordeal without a scratch. "Incredible," Davis murmured, running his hands over Thunder's flanks to check for wounds. "With all that shooting, I was sure he'd been hit at least once." Thompson nodded, equally amazed by Thunder's escape. He had seen men survive similar experiences through luck or divine intervention, but he had never seen anything quite like Thunder's charmed passage through enemy fire. The Confederate attack resumed about 20 minutes after Thunder's arrival, but the situation was now completely different. Company A's soldiers were well supplied with ammunition, and their confidence had been boosted by the successful completion of the resupply mission. When the gray-clad attackers emerged from the trees, they were met with such intense and accurate fire that their assault quickly broke down. Thunder watched the battle with apparent interest but no sign of fear. The mule had positioned himself in a relatively protected spot within the rifle pit, but he remained alert to everything happening around him. When wounded soldiers were brought back from the fighting line, Thunder moved aside to give the medics room to work, displaying the same consideration for others that had characterized his behavior throughout his military service. The Battle of Miller's Creek, as it came to be known in regimental histories, lasted for most of the day. The Confederates made several more attempts to overrun the Union positions, but each assault was beaten back with heavy losses. By evening, the enemy forces had withdrawn, leaving the field to the Union defenders. Thunder had played a crucial role in the victory. Without the ammunition he had delivered, Company A would almost certainly have been overrun during the first Confederate assault. The mule's courage in crossing the open ground under fire had quite literally saved the day, preserving the Union hold on this strategically important position. But Thunder's greatest moment was yet to come. As night fell and the immediate danger passed, Thompson began preparing for the return journey to the main camp. Thunder would travel much lighter now, carrying only a few wounded soldiers who needed medical attention that wasn't available at the advanced positions. The mule seemed refreshed by his rest and ready for the trek back. It was during the loading of the wounded that disaster struck. A Confederate artillery piece that the Union forces didn't know existed opened fire from a concealed position nearly a mile away. The first shell fell short, exploding harmlessly in the woods beyond the Union line. The second shell was closer, sending dirt and debris raining down on the rifle pits. But the third shell was perfectly aimed, and it was heading directly for the center of Company A's position where Thunder and the wounded soldiers were located. Thompson saw the incoming shell and realized immediately that there was no time for anyone to take cover. The projectile was going to land right among them, and the explosion would kill or wound everyone in the immediate area. It was one of those moments when time seems to slow down, when the human mind processes information with crystal clarity while being completely powerless to change the outcome. But Thunder was not powerless. The mule had heard the whistle of the incoming shell. His sensitive ears had detected it several seconds before any of the humans became aware of the danger. In that brief window of time, Thunder made a decision that would be remembered and talked about for generations. The mule deliberately stepped forward, placing his massive body directly between the incoming shell and the wounded soldiers who lay helpless on stretchers. Thunder stood motionless, his head raised, his ears forward, facing the approaching projectile with calm dignity. He made no attempt to flee, showed no sign of fear, gave no indication that he was anything other than completely prepared for what was about to happen. The shell struck Thunder in the chest and exploded on impact. The blast was tremendous, shaking the ground and throwing dirt and debris high into the air. When the smoke cleared, Thunder was gone, his body destroyed by the explosion that he had absorbed with his own flesh and blood. But the wounded soldiers were alive. Thunder's sacrifice had shielded them from the full force of the blast, and while several suffered additional injuries from flying debris, none were killed. The mule had given his life to save men who couldn't save themselves, completing his final mission with the same dedication and courage that had characterized his entire military career. The silence that followed the explosion was profound. Even the Confederate gunners seemed to realize that something extraordinary had occurred, and their artillery fell silent. The Union soldiers stared at the spot where Thunder had stood, struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Thompson was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew, Thompson said. Somehow. He knew what was coming. And he chose to stand in front of it. Davis nodded, tears streaming down his face. He had grown genuinely fond of Thunder during their time together, and the mule's sacrifice affected him deeply. He saved them all. He saw what was going to happen, and he chose to save them. Word of Thunder's sacrifice spread quickly through the Union forces. By the next morning, every soldier in the 15th Virginia Regiment had heard the story of the mule who had deliberately given his life to protect wounded comrades. The tale spread beyond the regiment to other units, and from there to the newspapers that followed the Army's movements. Within weeks, Thunder's story had reached the Northern press, where it was published in papers from Boston to San Francisco. The image of a heroic mule sacrificing himself to save wounded soldiers captured the public imagination in a way that few war stories had managed to do. Thunder became a symbol of courage, dedication, and selfless service that transcended the boundaries of species. In the decades that followed the war, Thunder's story grew and evolved. But the essential facts remained unchanged. A mule had deliberately chosen to sacrifice his own life to save the lives of human soldiers. Veterans of the 15th Virginia Regiment would tell and retell the story at their reunions, each time marveling again at Thunder's final act of heroism. A monument to Thunder was eventually erected at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, despite the fact that the mule had never served at that famous battle. The inscription reads simply, "Thunder, a Union mule who understood the meaning of duty." It was a fitting tribute to an animal who had demonstrated that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice were not exclusively human virtues. Sergeant Thompson survived the war and returned to his farm in Pennsylvania, where he lived for many more years. He never acquired another mule, saying that no animal could ever measure up to Thunder's standard. When visitors asked him to tell the story of Thunder's sacrifice, Thompson would always end with the same words, "That mule was a better soldier than most men I've known, and a braver one than I'll ever be." Corporal Davis also survived the war and became a successful businessman in Vermont. He named his first son Thomas, in honor of Thunder's memory, and he told the story of the heroic mule to his children and grandchildren throughout his long life. Davis always maintained that Thunder's sacrifice had taught him what true courage looked like, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite the fear. Captain Williams went on to have a distinguished military career, eventually retiring as a full colonel. In his memoirs, published many years after the war, he devoted an entire chapter to Thunder, writing, "I have commanded brave men in many battles, but I never saw courage purer or more selfless than that displayed by a mule named Thunder on a battlefield in Virginia. That animal understood duty and honor better than many humans, and his example continues to inspire me even now, in the twilight of my years." The Battle of Miller's Creek became a footnote in Civil War history, remembered primarily for Thunder's heroic sacrifice rather than for its strategic significance. But for the men who were there, for the soldiers whose lives were saved by a mule's courage, the battle represented something much more important than military strategy. It represented proof that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected sources, that the capacity for selfless sacrifice existed in creatures great and small. Years later, when the surviving veterans of Company A gathered for their final reunion, they raised a toast to Thunder's memory. These old men, bent with age and worn by the passage of time, still remembered with perfect clarity the moment when a mule had chosen to die so that they might live. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary on that distant battlefield, a demonstration of love, courage, and sacrifice that had changed their understanding of what it meant to be truly brave. Thunder's story became part of American folklore, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables, in schoolrooms and churches, wherever people gathered to share stories of heroism and sacrifice. The tale of the mule who gave his life for his comrades resonated with people from all walks of life, reminding them that greatness could emerge from the humblest origins, that courage was not the exclusive province of humans, and that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism came from the most unexpected sources. In the end, Thunder had achieved something that very few soldiers, human or otherwise, ever accomplish. He had found a way to make his death meaningful, to ensure that his sacrifice would be remembered and honored for generations to come. The mule who had never sought glory, who had simply done his duty day after day with quiet determination, had earned a place in history through his final, selfless act of courage. The legacy of Thunder's sacrifice extended far beyond the immediate circle of soldiers who witnessed it. In the months following the Battle of Miller's Creek, stories of the heroic mule spread through the Union Army like wildfire. Soldiers who had never met Thunder claimed him as their own, adopting his memory as a source of inspiration during the darkest days of the war. His story became a rallying cry for units facing overwhelming odds, a reminder that duty and courage could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. The Confederate soldiers who had been present at Miller's Creek were equally affected by Thunder's sacrifice. Many of them had been farmers before the war, men who understood and respected the value of good working animals. When they learned the full story of what Thunder had done, how he had deliberately placed himself between the artillery shell and the wounded Union soldiers, even some of the most hardened Confederate veterans found themselves moved by the mule's courage. War had a way of stripping away everything except the most fundamental human emotions, and Thunder's sacrifice spoke to something universal that transcended the boundaries of blue and gray. Letters written home by soldiers from both sides began to include references to Thunder's heroism. A Confederate private from Georgia wrote to his wife, "Today I heard a story that made me think of our old mule Jake back home. There was a Union mule that gave his life to save wounded soldiers. And I found myself hoping that if our Jake was ever in such a situation, he would show the same kind of courage. It made me proud to be part of a species that can inspire such loyalty in our animal companions." A Union corporal from Ohio wrote to his parents, "I know you will find this hard to believe, but yesterday, I heard about a mule that deliberately sacrificed himself to save human lives. The story has affected every man in our regiment, and we have decided to name our unit mascot Thunder in honor of this brave animal. If a mule can show such courage and dedication, then surely we human soldiers can find the strength to do our duty as well." The story reached the highest levels of military command when General Ulysses S. Grant himself heard about Thunder's sacrifice during a staff meeting. Grant, who had grown up on a farm and understood the value of good animals, was reportedly moved to tears by the tale. He ordered that Thunder's story be included in the official regimental history of the 15th Virginia Regiment, ensuring that the mule's heroism would be preserved for future generations. President Abraham Lincoln, already burdened by the enormous casualty lists that crossed his desk daily, found solace in Thunder's story when it was related to him by his Secretary of War. Lincoln, who had spent his youth working with animals on the frontier, understood the significance of Thunder's sacrifice in a way that perhaps only another farm boy could. He reportedly said to his cabinet, "If the animals of this nation can show such devotion to the cause of freedom, then surely we must not fail them in our determination to see this war through to a just conclusion." The impact of Thunder's story extended beyond the military sphere into civilian life throughout the North. Newspaper editors, always eager for stories that would boost morale on the home front, published detailed accounts of the mule's heroism. Children in school began learning about Thunder alongside the human heroes of American history. Sunday sermons in churches across New England included references to the mule who had given his life for others, with ministers drawing parallels between Thunder's sacrifice and the ultimate sacrifice that formed the foundation of Christian faith. Women's aid societies, which had been organized to support the war effort by providing supplies and medical care for soldiers, adopted Thunder as an unofficial mascot. They organized Thunder drives to collect money for military hospitals, and they sewed images of mules into the quilts they made for wounded soldiers. The symbol of the mule became associated with selfless service and dedication to duty. Even in the South, where Union stories were generally received with skepticism or hostility, Thunder's sacrifice resonated with people who understood the bond between humans and animals. Southern newspapers, while careful not to praise the Union cause, nevertheless published accounts of Thunder's heroism as an example of the nobility that could be found even in the midst of war's brutality. The story took on mythic proportions as it spread. Some versions claimed that Thunder had carried wounded soldiers to safety on his back before making his final sacrifice. Others suggested that the mule had somehow known about the incoming artillery shell hours before it was fired, giving him time to position himself perfectly to protect the maximum number of human lives. While these embellishments strayed from the documented facts, they reflected the profound impact that Thunder's actual sacrifice had on the American imagination. Artists began creating paintings and sculptures depicting Thunder's heroic moment. The most famous of these, a massive oil painting by the renowned artist Frederick Remington, showed Thunder standing calmly in the face of the incoming artillery shell, his body positioned protectively in front of a group of wounded soldiers. The painting, titled The Last Stand of Thunder, became one of the most reproduced images of the Civil War era, hanging in homes and public buildings throughout the country. Musicians composed songs about Thunder's sacrifice, and these ballads were sung around campfires and in family parlors from Maine to California. The most popular of these, the Ballad of Thunder the Brave, included the refrain, "When duty calls and danger threatens, may we all be brave as thunder." who gave his life for those who couldn't fight, and sleep now peaceful under. The 15th Virginia Regiment adopted Thunder's image as their official insignia, and they carried it with them through the remaining campaigns of the war. The symbol of a mule standing protectively over wounded soldiers became synonymous with the regiment's identity, and new recruits were required to learn the story of Thunder's sacrifice as part of their basic training. After the war ended, veterans of the regiment established the Thunder Memorial Fund, which provided financial assistance to disabled former soldiers and their families. The fund was supported by donations from across the country, as Thunder's story had touched the hearts of Americans regardless of their regional loyalties or political affiliations. The first Thunder Memorial Scholarship was awarded in 1870 to a young man from Virginia whose father had been wounded at the Battle of Miller's Creek. The scholarship enabled him to attend college and eventually become a doctor, fulfilling Thunder's legacy of service to others. Similar scholarships were established in other states, creating a network of educational opportunities that honored the memory of the heroic mule. Schools throughout the country began including Thunder's story in their curricula, using it to teach children about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of putting others before oneself. Teachers found that the story of a mule's heroism was particularly effective in capturing young imaginations while conveying important moral lessons. The Thunder Memorial Society was founded in 1875 to preserve and promote the memory of the heroic mule. The society organized annual memorial services, maintained historical records related to Thunder's life and service, and worked to ensure that his story continued to be told to new generations. Membership in the society grew to include people from all walks of life, united by their admiration for Thunder's example of selfless service. Medical colleges began using Thunder's story as an example of the kind of dedication and self-sacrifice that should characterize the medical profession. Young doctors were encouraged to emulate Thunder's willingness to put the welfare of others before his own safety, to serve without regard for personal cost or recognition. Military academies incorporated Thunder's story into their honor codes, holding up the mule's example as the standard of courage and dedication that should guide all members of the armed forces. Cadets were required to memorize the details of Thunder's sacrifice, and to write essays analyzing the factors that had enabled a simple animal to demonstrate such extraordinary heroism. Religious leaders found in Thunder's story a powerful example of sacrificial love that could be understood by people of all faiths and backgrounds. The mule's willing acceptance of death to save others resonated with fundamental spiritual principles that transcended denominational boundaries. As the 20th century approached, Thunder's story remained as powerful and relevant as ever. The rapid changes brought by industrialization and urbanization threatened to disconnect Americans from their agricultural roots, but Thunder's example reminded them of the nobility and wisdom that could be found in the natural world. His story became a bridge between America's rural past and its urban future, a reminder that the virtues of courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice were needed as much in the modern world as they had been during the Civil War. The centennial of Thunder's sacrifice in 1963 was marked by memorial services throughout the country. President John F. Kennedy, speaking at a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, said, "Thunder's story reminds us that greatness is not determined by species or status, but by the willingness to serve others at the cost of oneself. In an age when we send men to the moon and split the atom, we should not forget the simple lesson taught by a mule in Virginia, that the highest calling of any sentient being is to give of themselves for the welfare of others." Modern military units continued to draw inspiration from Thunder's example. During World War II, an entire division adopted Thunder's name and insignia, carrying his memory to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Stories circulated of soldiers who had performed extraordinary acts of heroism after remembering Thunder's example, suggesting that the mule's influence continued to save lives even decades after his death. And so Thunder's story lives on, a testament to the truth that heroism comes in many forms, that courage knows no boundaries of species or station, and that sometimes, in the darkest moments of human conflict, the brightest examples of nobility and sacrifice come from the most humble and unexpected sources. The mule named Thunder had proven that true greatness is not measured by size or species, but by the willingness to give everything for others, to place duty and honor above personal safety, and to face death with dignity when duty demands the ultimate sacrifice. In a world that often seems dominated by selfishness and cynicism, Thunder's memory continues to remind us of the potential for goodness that exists within all living beings, and of the transformative power of one individual's decision to choose love over fear, service over self-preservation, and courage over comfort.